Do you know the largest amount ever bet on a horse race? Or how about the most horses ever entered in a steeplechase race? Did you ever hear the story about a horse that wrecked an entire bank? For answers to these and much, much more, we're back for a second episode this week on horse racing. The first episode last week we covered there's about 5 or 6 total folders on horse racing. But this week we've got 3 more folders to go. This folder on steeplechase and jumping, another one on horse racing bettings and winnings, and the final one will wrap up on the Kentucky Derby. So stay tuned for this week's episode here at Strange As It Seems. Welcome back. This is Jeff Hicks, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hicks, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. Before we jump in, I'd like to ask you to hit the button to subscribe, leave a like, or better yet, even a comment, which goes a long way to helping revive this brand, 100-year-old brand, and bring it back to the digital age. So let's start off with the first folder here on steeplechase and jumping. On the oldest comic strip in the folder, looks like from 1928. These were all really the first ones that John Hicks did before he even put the date on them. So not really sure when it was published, but this was 1928. Ted Elder, the world champion trick rider, stands on 2 horses and jumps over an automobile in a 1928 magazine article of Ted Elder jumping with a couple of people sitting in the back seat watching him go over. And just a few years later, in 1931, King's Own. Here's a horse that jumped 8 feet 3 inches. I found the old clipping from the newspaper here too. A record-breaking jump with Fred Waddox Jr. In the saddle. Here he is clearing the jump. Goodness, that's high. And looking back at it as his horse's back feet clear the jump. Incredible. Even more incredible when you look up the highest jump ever, and it looks like this is it. Google says that 2.47 meters in 1949 by Hawasso, the horse, and his rider, Captain Alberto Larraguibel. That thoroughbred stallion cleared 8 feet 1 inch high, but this one is actually 8 feet 3 inches. So this may be the highest jump ever recorded in history, strange as it seems. And here's another amazing horse. This is from 1941, still in the John Hicks era. Mint Dior, for 4 years was a champion jumper. Here's Mint Dior, the wonder horse, going over that barrel. Here's one of Mint Dior clearing this is a jump record of 29 feet 5 inches over a automobile. Another exhibition clearing the automobile. And here's Mint Dior, world's greatest exhibition wonder horse, actually jumping through fire. Amazing. But the most amazing thing is Mint Dior started out as a plow horse, strange as it seems. And now on to the steeplechase stories in that first folder here. Didn't know this, but steeplechasing actually originated as a horse race with the church steeple in the distance as its goal. And that's how the steeplechase started. This was first published in 1936. And again, right after John Hicks passed away. This year they just said by Hicks, but it was actually being run at the time by his brother and my grandfather, Ernest Hicks. And in the 1933 Grand National Steeplechase, the winner was Kelsborough Jack. The amazing thing was the purse he won was $36,725, but right before the race, he was sold for only $25. And here's another amazing race in 1939. This is the Napier Steeplechase in Wellington, New Zealand. Total free-for-all race, but spectators ended up mounting 2 horses that had thrown their jockeys, and they ended up finishing in 2nd and 3rd place in that race. And in 1911, the only horse to finish the 1911 Grand National Steeplechase was Glenside, and the amazing thing was he was blind in one eye. And moving on into the era of Elsie Hicks, my grandmother, who took over the comic strip when my grandfather Ernest died in a plane crash in 1948. But she actually picked up a story that John Hicks my great uncle had run in 1937. It was the most horses ever entered in a steeplechase race, 66 horses. This is in the 1929 Grand National. And out of that, only 10 finished. That was the story by John Hicks. But my grandma added the other amazing thing. The odds are about 5-1 against horses even finishing a steeplechase race like this. But the winner, Grigalak, was a 100-1 shot. And my grandmother Elsie featured another famous steeplechase horse. Notice Billy Barton was his name. He came in second actually in the 1928 steeplechase race. There was only 2 horses in it. He was winning the race and he slipped through his rider. Tipperary Tim passed him, and then he ended up coming in second. But just a beloved horse, so beloved, in fact, that when he died here in 1952, I've got a letter here from the Laurel Race Course, the Maryland State Fair, where they erected a life-sized statue that stands today of Billy Barton. Now here's kind of an interesting steeplechase race that takes place in the annual Blockhouse Hunt races. This is in Tryon, North Carolina, but the horse race takes place across 2 states and even 3 counties. And this one jump that they featured, there's a photograph of it here as well. They take off in North Carolina, they land in South Carolina. And the final one in the steeplechase folder, this is actually going back to the John Hicks era as well, and going back to the 1845 Grand National steeplechase race, in which Curall won. And the amazing thing about Curall is the odds were so long that not a single wager was placed that day on Curall, who won the race in 1845. And that brings us to our second folder of the 3 folders we're going to cover to wrap up horse racing in this week's episode. This one's on bettings and winnings, and as usual, for a subject, it was featured in the John Hicks scrapbook. This was in looks like November 16th of 1941, and another worthless winner, Sweet Vestal, would have paid $1,318.50 to win, but nobody bet on her. This is back in 1934, and my grandma featured this again. Grandma Elsie featured it back in the 1952, and she even wrote the Charlestown Jockey Club to get confirmation, and got a letter back from the secretary of the Charlestown Jockey Club, but another worthless winner. And continuing around the horn for this John Hicks scrapbook entitled For Better, Bettor, or Worse, how about the story of the horse that wrecked a bank? Crazy story here. So heavily did the local citizens of Midway, Kentucky bet on their local pride, Rolled Stockings. This is in the 1927 Kentucky Derby. The town's bank had to close its doors when the horse came in 9th place. Crazy story there. How about the horse named 1760, and it paid $17.60, $10.20 to win, $4 to place, and $3.40 to show. This is back in Jefferson Park, Louisiana, 1931. And how about this one, where everybody cashed in, but nobody won? In the heat between Apprentice and Pardee. Crazy. But Apprentice and Starfire ran coupled as an entry against Pardee. The entry lost 5 cents on the dollar, and all the Pardee bettors broke even. Nobody won. Crazy. How about Watch Her? Here's a horse, 6-5 favorite before the race, paid $150 to 1 when she won. Crazy. Coy Made Purse. This is at Belmont Park. And then the final one, this is an amazing figure. President of the Los Angeles Jockey Club, Joseph Smoot, builder also of the Hialeah Park track, famous racetrack in Miami, noted turf figure for years, never once bet on a horse race. Looks like that was featured back in 1933 here by John Hicks, and I even have a photograph of the great Joseph Smoot, famous figure in horse racing. Here's a crazy story going back to 1906 in Windsor, England. Apparently James Ival bet $1,000 against a lighted cigar on a horse race and lost. How about this poor bettor? I even have a handwritten letter from George Stidham from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was down to his last $8. And so on a whim and a little bit superstitious, he bet his last $8 on the number 8 horse, Highlance. Odds were 8-1. And it was in the 8th race at Saratoga. It was on August 8th, 1940. And the horse came in, you guessed it, 8th. And here was, at least at the time, the largest bet ever bet on a single horse race was $2,500,000. Doncaster, St. Leger, England. This is back in 1836. Largest amount ever recorded, and apparently lost the bet. Crazy. But that was not the most ever bet. I did find an article on May 13th of this year in Sports Illustrated, talking about the biggest wagers in horse racing history. Some amazing stories in here too. There was a $2 million bet on Justify. This was in the 2018 Kentucky Derby. Bettor was anonymous, but the payout was $3.6 million. Crazy. But the largest wager ever looks like the 2008 Dubai World Cup. $10 million wager by Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum. Obviously, a horse racing man himself, bet on his own horse, which was well armed, the name Well Armed, in the 2006 Dubai World Cup, and he also lost. And going back to 1931 comic strip here, but was actually reported back at Haydock Park in England, November 1929. The greatest long shot on record, Cool was the name of the horse, paid $3,410-1. Crazy, November of 1929. And it does look like to hold up. I'm looking at this same Sports Illustrated, but here's another one. How about this? The $1.5 million Superfecta. This is the 2007 Breeders' Cup Classic. Someone, anonymous, wagered $1.5 million, and the outcome payout was $35 million. Probably one of the most talked about and lucrative bets in horse racing history. 2007, during the Breeders' Cup Classic, an anonymous bettor placed a staggering $1.5 million Superfecta. And this is a bet that basically requires that you pick the first 4 horses in order. So it's not just betting on one horse, but 4 horses, the first 4 in exact order. Typically, bettors don't place massive wagers on these long shots, but for this lucky gambler, the result was a mind-blowing $35 million payout, the largest single-ticket win in racing history. Strange as it seems. And another funny one, this is actually from the Ernest Hicks era, and I imagine my grandfather, Ernest, was a bit of a rake, as they say in the old days. Lots of horse racing betting stories from him, and I imagine he did quite a bit at the track himself of betting on horse races. But this is a funny one. Snowden Carter, he's a handicapper, right? So he picks all the races in the newspaper. He picked all 8 winners in his selections for the Baltimore Sun. Went to the horse track that day and bet himself on a race and lost. And here's a photo of Snowden Carter, and actually a letter from the sports editor as well, and a letter from Snowden Carter corroborating this in 1948. And the final kind of amazing fact was started by Ernest, my grandfather. This was in, looks like 1947, but he said he basically figured out, I guess he got a letter from the state of California, the California Horse Racing Board. He found out the value of all of the uncashed winning tickets, and it was over $247,000, $247,510 in uncashed winning tickets at the horse track. And then my grandma picked this up. She kind of thought this was an amazing fact, and she did this again in 1952, and she tried to figure out, kind of estimate what the uncashed winnings were kind of across the country. She got back from the California Horse Racing Board in 1953. She also got back how much, that was $196,000 that year, $99,000 from the Illinois Racing Board and several others as well. But she basically figured out that uncashed winning horse race tickets across the country in 1 year, over $1 million uncashed. Crazy. And the final folder to cover here for this Strange As It Seems back-to-back episodes on horse racing is the one on Kentucky Derby. This is actually the oldest. From 1939 shows that the 3 oldest U.S. horse races of uninterrupted running originated actually in the same track on the same week, and that was at Churchill Downs. Of course, the Kentucky Derby was on May 17th of 1875. That followed by the Kentucky Oaks on May 19th and the Clark Handicap on May 22nd. So the oldest running horse race of all time, the Kentucky Derby, and the oldest John Hicks comic strip, another one of these really old 1928 comic strips on horse racing, featured Donna Rail, Kentucky Derby winner from 1913, paid out $184.90 on $2 tickets. Longest odds on a Derby winner, at least by 1928. Which owner and which farm won the most Kentucky Derby winners? This is, of course, going back to the 1930s and 40s, but at that time, Colonel Edward Bradley was the only man to own 3 Kentucky Derby winners. And I have an article here from Time Magazine corroborating that from 1932. And the farm with the most winners at the time, this is 1939, was Hamburg Place. I have a letter here from Hamburg Place in Lexington, Kentucky, with a couple of awesome photographs of the barn. They had 6 Kentucky Derby winners. Of course, since that time, Calumet Farm now has 8 wins, one of the most legendary names in all of American racing, currently holds the record for the most Derby wins by any owner, although Starlight Racing is kind of an ownership group. They have 13 wins, and Windstar Farm, another ownership, huge ownership group. They have the largest number of kind of Derby wins. They have 23. Wow. Wins. But this is, of course, now with the large conglomerates that own horses together, but still amazing Kentucky Derby winners facts. And going back to 1938, Colonel Matt Wynn, who was president of the American Turf Association at the time in 1939, had seen every single Kentucky Derby ever run going back to 1875. I have an article here in 1938. Battle of the Blue Bloods, Kentucky Derby, America's greatest racing classic, with the fact of Matt Wynn having attended. Apparently, he said the first one in 1875 I witnessed as a 14-year-old boy. I drove to town in a farm wagon with my father, and to get a good view of the race, I climbed a tree. And in terms of consecutive wins, this is going back into jockeys too. We did some great stories last week from the folder on jockeys, but here's a famous black jockey, Wingfield, won the Kentucky Derby 2 consecutive years in 1901 and 1902. Apparently, and there was a letter in here too, he was not the only one. In fact, there was a letter written from Brockton Enterprises and said the only winner, there was also another one, was Isaac Murphy, one of the best race riders, another black jockey who rode 3 winners in the Derby and rode back-to-back 1890 and 1891. That record held for, looks like 100 years before back-to-backs again. Crazy. 1982 and 1983, Eddie De La Houssaye won back-to-back. Calvin Burrell did in 2009 and 10, and Victor Espinoza in 2014 and 2015. And at the time, Earl Sandy This is from 1935. We featured him earlier before. He was the only man at the time to ever ride 3 Kentucky Derby winners. But amazing, he set the record after doctors told him he would never ride again. Amazing story. I have a whole article here on the great, they called him Handy Sandy, and that's him at the microphone. He was a nightclub singer after he retired. Hero of 1,000 horse races. Amazing jockey. But actually, the record now held by the most wins is tied. Eddie Arcaro has 5 wins, spanned classics like Whirl Away and Citation. And then Bill Hartack has 5 wins, also tied. And he kind of dominated during the 1950s and 60s. And the final story on horse racing to wrap up these 2 episodes came in the era of Elsie Hicks. I love this one. In 1951, she said, "Will it happen tomorrow?" And she said, according to all available records, no horse starting from post position number 9 has ever won the Kentucky Derby. And she has here a letter corroborating that from actually from Churchill Downs directly. And sure enough, I looked and I said Kentucky Derby winners from post position 9, Count Turf won in 1951. So quite a prophetic comic strip from my grandma Elsie. Will it happen tomorrow? Indeed it did. In 1951, Count Turf won, and 3 other horses, Tommy Lee, Venetian Way, and Riva Ridge, have also won from position 9 since. And I'll wrap up this episode, as I often do, with this quote from my granduncle John Hicks from the foreword of his 1928 book, Strange as It Seems. The author launches this book of the curious in nature and humankind on the vast sea of public opinion with the hope that it will fulfill its mission to entertain and acquaint its readers with some of the marvels of the world in which we live.